Hello students, I hope you're all doing well. Today we are going to start with the second chapter of your prose section, which is An Excellent Father. This story is an extract, a small part of a very famous novel, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. In fact, this is my favorite novel. This is a very beautiful story. It is such a famous novel that it has been adapted into many English movies, Hindi movies, serials, books, etc. An example I'll give you, Aishwarya Rai, she acted in a 2004 version of this story by the name Bride and Prejudice. In Hindi it was Balle Balle Amritsar to LA. And the best adaptation of this so far is a movie by the name Pride and Prejudice in 2005. Now, what is the main theme of the story? The main theme is marriage. During those times, 1813, when the story has been written, the families would not give their properties to the daughters. The property of the family was to be inherited by any male member. Even if they didn't have any son, they would have to give it away to a relative, be it a cousin or anyone. So marriages during those times were not because of love, rather they were married for financial security and securing their future. That was the main aim. Now Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, they are the main characters of this story. They had 5 daughters in total. Yes, 5. In your story it has been mentioned that they had 3 daughters of marriageable age, which means out of the 5 daughters they had, 3 were old enough to get married. The other 2 daughters were young. Also, there's another mistake that I've observed a lot, that because 3 names have been mentioned in your chapter, Lizzie, Elizabeth and Kitty. So there's a common mistake that people make. They think that the 3 daughters are namely Lizzie, Elizabeth and Kitty. But that is not the case, because Lizzie and Elizabeth are one and the same person. The eldest daughter was Jane. The second number daughter was Elizabeth, nicknamed as Lizzie. The third daughter was Mary. Then there was Catherine, who is referred to as Kitty in your story. And the last one was Lydia. So only 2 daughters have been mentioned by name in your story, Lizzie and Kitty, Elizabeth and Catherine. Apart from Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, who are the main characters, the characters mentioned in the story are Mr. Bingley, Mrs. Long. She is a friend and neighbor of Mrs. Bennet. She has 2 nieces which are also mentioned in the story. Now, as I've told you that Mr. and Mrs. Bennet had 5 daughters, it was very obvious that Mrs. Bennet was worried and concerned about the marriage of her daughters. She was always on the lookout for some eligible bachelor. Mrs. Bennet tries to talk to Mr. Bennet and inform him that she had just come to know from Mrs. Long that a very rich young man named Mr. Bingley was coming to live in Netherfield Park, which was a big mansion nearby their place. They had even come to know about his income, which was 4,000 to 5,000 per year. 4,000 to 5,000 pounds sterling. In today's time, it would be near about 4 to 5 lakh, which is not a big amount. But the story is from your 18th century, and during that time, it was a very big amount. So Mrs. Bennet tried to convince or persuade Mr. Bennet that please go and meet him. Persuade means manana. Making acquaintance means jaan pehchan karna, to make familiar. Now, why she wanted this? Her plan was that if they make acquaintance with Mr. Bingley, he will come to their house, and when he meets them, he will fall in love with one of their daughters. She was sure about this. Mr. Bennet, on the other hand, was not very interested. He showed no interest. He was like, I don't want to go. You take your daughters. If you want, I will send a slip mentioning that, Mr. Bingley, you can choose any of the girls. He was making fun of her concern for their daughters, and he was acting very unconcerned for the future of their daughters. This irritated Mrs. Bennet like anything. Initially, she was not able to understand the witty remarks, taunts of Mr. Bennet. But later, when she realized that he is not agreeing to go and meet Mr. Bingley, she got very upset. She was having health phobia, which is hypochondria. This means वहम होना. वहम होता है कि मेरा दिल बहुत ज़ोर से धड़क रहा है, मुझे कुछ हो रहा है, राइट? सो वेन एवर मिसेज बेनेट यूज टू नॉट गेट हर वे, जब चीज़ें उसके अकॉर्डिंग नहीं होती थी, वॉट शी यूज टू डू, शी यूज टू से दैट यू आर ट्रबलिंग मी, आई एम सफरिंग अ लॉट, मुझे कुछ हो रहा है, आप मुझे परेशान कर रहे हैं. दिस इज वॉट शी डज हियर एज वेल. शी टेल्स मिस्टर बेनेट दैट यू आर नॉट कंसर्न अबाउट माई वेल बींग, यू आर नॉट कंसर्न अबाउट माई हेल्थ, दैट इज वाई यू आर ट्रबलिंग मी मेंटली. मिस्टर बेनेट अगेन मेक्स सम जोक और द अदर, and this conversation ends on a bad note. Mrs. Bennet, she was very upset. Later on, it is revealed that although Mr. Bennet was saying no, that he will not go and meet, he was amongst the first people who went and actually met Mr. Bingley, which means he was also concerned. But he was very calm in his approach. He was not showing his worry like Mrs. Bennet did. But he went quietly and met Mr. Bingley. This was not known by his family. So, during the evening, Mrs. Bennet, she was in a very bad mood. And we all know that when the mothers of a house are in bad mood, they scold the children for every small thing. Means they are irritated, and so anyone and everyone can get scolded by them. She was very upset. Now, what did Mr. Bennet do? He came and sat and he saw that Elizabeth was trimming a hat. Trimming means adding an embellishment to beautify something. For example, this lace is an extra. This is a trimming added to this dress to make it look more pretty. So, Elizabeth was trimming her hat. She was adding accessories and decorating her hat. Mr. Bennet, he told her that I hope Mr. Bingley likes this, likes your hat. To this, Mrs. Bennet, who was upset, she said that how would we know that Mr. Bingley will like it or not? Because of you, we will not meet him. You are not only ready to go and make acquaintance. To pacify her mother, Elizabeth, she said, Mama, don't worry. Even if Papa does not go, we still have another option. Mrs. Long has promised you that she will introduce us to him during the assemblies, which was a kind of a public gathering. So, Mrs. Bennet was so upset that she called her own friend, she referred to her as a selfish woman. She said that I do not trust Mrs. Long. I don't think she will introduce us to Mr. Bingley. Why? Because Mrs. Long has 2 nieces of her own. So, before thinking about us, she will want to get one of her nieces married. So because of your father, we will miss this golden opportunity. Now, while she was having this conversation, Kitty, she coughed. Mrs. Bennet was so upset with Mr. Bennet that she snapped at Kitty. Snapped means डांट दिया उसको. What did she say? Kitty, don't cough. Have some compassion on my poor nerves. Don't cough like that. Then Mr. Bennet again came up with a witty remark. उन्होंने फिर से टॉन्ट मारा. What did he say? Kitty has no discretion on her curves. इसकी टाइमिंग खांसने की बड़ी गलत है. Kitty, obviously she was surprised. मतलब आपने खांसी कर दी और कोई आपको उस पर डांट दे. She replied that I don't cough for my amusement. मैं अपनी खुशी से नहीं खांसी कर रही. She was upset that she was scolded for no reason. Now Mr. Bennet, to change the topic, he said, okay, let us return to the topic of Mr. Bingley. By now Mrs. Bennet was so angry, so upset, so irritated. She was like, I am sick of Mr. Bingley, which meant कि मुझे उसकी बात ही नहीं करनी है, मैं परेशान हो गई हूँ. Why? Because she was not getting her way. She was not able to convince Mr. Bennet, so she was very irritated. To this, finally, Mr. Bennet disclosed the fact that he had met him by saying what? That, Acha, you don't like him anymore. You should have told me before, because by now so I have already met him. I went and I met him, and I've made acquaintance, and I've invited him, so he will come to our house now. Now you cannot avoid meeting him, so it's very bad that you don't like him now. And when the family, the daughters and Mrs. Bennet came to know this, they were so surprised. And of course, who was the most surprised? Mrs. Bennet. Her entire mood changed immediately. She was very angry till now, and now she was like, oh, what a pleasant surprise. And then she started taking the credit of this. I knew that you cared for your daughters, and I knew that I would be able to persuade you to go and meet Mr. Bingley. Also, it is a very nice joke that you went and met him and you did not inform us. So she took a 360-degree turn. Her entire mood was changed, and she was like happy and cracking jokes. Mr. Bennet, now he knew that his wife was happy. He left the room, and while leaving, he told Kitty that you can cough now as much as you like, because no one is going to scold you, because your mother is now in a good mood. Finally, when Mr. Bennet left, Mrs. Bennet made a declaration. What an excellent father you have, girls. By this she meant that Mr. Bennet had proved to be an excellent father, because he had proved that he was also concerned for the future and the happiness of his daughters, and he had made the efforts to go and meet Mr. Bingley. Fun fact. Mrs. Bennet's plan actually proved to be a successful one. Mr. Bingley did fall in love with their eldest daughter, Jane, and it was a happy ending. Now, to conclude, we can talk about the characteristics of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. While Mr. Bennet was very witty or sarcastic, Mrs. Bennet was a very simple lady. She didn't get the jokes or the taunts of her husband. Mr. Bennet was laid back in his approach. He was very casual about things. On the other hand, Mrs. Bennet, she worried a lot. Then Mr. Bennet was a calm person, and Mrs. Bennet, she was very irritable. She used to get irritated very easily. But the main thing is that both of them were concerned about the well-being and the future of their daughters. So this is all about You're an Excellent Father. I hope you have understood, and in case if you face any difficulty, do let me know. So that's all.